that you may be partly familiar with, but I think we'll be drilling down on some ideas and their application that hopefully will be a bit fresh and a bit different. One of the points about bringing an Australian to these events. So if you've got comments or questions, please do intrude. How many have heard the term well, you'll have heard the term contestability. How many have heard it as anything other than outsourcing or competition? No, not really. So let me just contextualise this. The reason that contestability, which is the credible threat of competition, not necessarily actual competition, the reason why it matters in commissioning is that commissioning is inherently about either dealing with devolved authority or it's about devolving authority. And when you do that, it's important that the commissioner still has control or has a level of control that permits them to still be the commissioner. Contestability is an important tool for ensuring that the commissioner retains control. That's where it's sort of rooted conceptually. It begins in the late 80s with a group of economists. Will Baumel was the one that I sort of knew most of, realising that you don't need to have actual competition in order for organisations to behave in the private sector, in the market, to behave competitively. It is sufficient that you have the credible threat of competition. And it's about the threat of entry. It's that sort of challenge, and for the economists among you, it's about low barriers to entry and exit is the sort of what we're dealing with. So it is potential rather than actual competition, low barriers to entry and exit, and a large number of independent providers are not necessary. That's the sort of been assumption in economic theory, is that you needed a large supply side, and contestability theory sort of led to the insight, well, you actually don't need to have that in order to have a contestable market. It is picked up in this country in the public sector, by Chris Ham, who of course now is head of the King's Fund. He was then a health economist at Birmingham, later went on to do a lot of work with the NHS. And Chris, this is, if you look at the date, this is at the end of the NHS internal market. And Chris was saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. He said there's a middle way between planning and competition, which is contestability. It is based on the premise that performance may stagnate unless there are sufficient incentives to bring about continuous improvement. In a contestable health service, it's the possibility that, and he said contracting, but it is just the right to manage. That's all we're talking about. It is the possibility that the right to manage may move that creates an incentive within the system, rather than the actual movement of the right to manage. Of course, for this to be a real incentive, then the right to manage is going to have to shift from time to time. So it's that sort of insight that Chris Ham brings to, can we take this idea and apply it in a public sector setting? Jeff Mulgan picked it up and played with it, but played with it only at the time. With the right design, contestability range can achieve many of the benefits of competition without the substantial costs associated with quasi-markets. And then at the same year, the IPPR, which of course is a centre-left think tank, in one of their reports, discussed it, made the point that it's this real possibility that you can switch to alternative providers that is interesting about contestability. It is applied without people necessarily linking it to theory in the prison service in that same period. So this is Martinelli, who was then head of the prison service, making the point about Dartmoor that he said when he visited, he was shocked to see how appalling it was. And he spoke to the union bluntly said to him things aren't going to change, and he said, well, they will change, and they'll change within 26 weeks or someone else will be running this establishment. And then his comment was, improvements that might have taken years to drive through were achieved in 26 weeks, and all because staff knew that we could get someone else to run the prison decently and effectively if they could not or would not. Now, the operative term there from a contestability perspective is decently and effectively. It wasn't that there were theoretical other providers. Delivering a public service like a prison requires some very specific knowledge and expertise, and it requires the people in the system to know and be comfortable with the provider. And so it wasn't just that there were theoretical others, it was that there were others who already were part of the system, knew it, were trusted, understood the way the system worked and what would be required of them. So it was, this is this point about low barriers to entry. If it's just theoretically we could bring the private sector in or the not-for-profit sector in to run this, that's still a high barrier to entry for any complex human services. Obviously, if it's just supplying pencils and light bulbs, that's really easy to do. You can get them from anywhere, very low barriers to entry. Somewhat more complex, and you've got to think about some other issues when you're dealing with complex human services. The other example that was going on around at this time was in the health sector, and this is a slide that Patricia Hewitt put up at a civil service conference seminar when the independent sector treatment centres were introduced. And this is waiting times for the particular elective surgery that the ISTC's covered. What I find fascinating about this is look at where choice comes in, where the first ISTC comes online. The collapse has already started before the ISTCs begin operations. It's the credible threat that is driving changes in behaviour, not the actual introduction of external providers. And indeed there were a number of cases, and they were documented at the time, where they didn't need to actually then have an an external provider come in. The behaviours had begun to change within the system because there was the prospect that somebody else could be brought in to deliver this particular service. And look, it's been talked about, but I don't think necessarily done comprehensively since. This is NOMS in 2006, challenging underperforming prisons and probation boards to demonstrate how they'll improve with contests held to commission alternative provision if existing providers fail to provide or deliver a satisfactory improvement plan. That's the credible threat with a process of challenge. So it's been round. It hasn't been, however, developed in a particularly systematic way. And when I wrote a report on this a couple of years ago, a paper, the first paper to systematically deal with this as a concept. And I got in touch with Chris Ham and said, Chris, did you ever take that any further? Has anyone else taken it any further? And he said, no, I never did, and I'm not aware of anyone else who has. So while the roots of it lie here, and there are a couple of academic papers that actually demonstrate contestability in action, very little of that has been worked with systematically. People have not sort of looked at it as a tool and how might you use it. So just a couple of academic studies, 87 solid waste collection in 2 municipalities in Greater Vancouver, one periodically recompeted, the other one a public monopoly. Under the threat of contracting out, the in-house team delivered comparable productivity savings. They didn't actually go to the market, they responded. But there was something else happening in another part of the market at the time, so the message was there are alternatives. Aged care in Stockholm services that had not yet been exposed to direct competition delivered larger cost savings than those that had been market tested. Sydney water maintenance, and I'll come back on this case study in a minute, has been studied by some academics. Civil maintenance, which was transformed in-house, delivered as much or more perhaps than the mechanical and electrical maintenance, which was outsourced. And then another interesting case study last year with UK Terminal Air Navigation Services, NATS, the National Air NATS, anyway, I forget what it stands for. It was the emergence of alternatives to this monopoly, including the people developing the capability to, airports developing the capability to do it themselves. It's that which then cracked it open and drove lower cost. So, let me just then talk a little bit about the Sydney Water case study, which I find quite intriguing, and I think lays some of the framework for thinking about this as a conscious tool. So in 2012, a government pricing regulator in New South Wales, my home state, recommended price reductions of 30% over 4 years. So fairly significant price reductions. 173 million in savings with no reduction. There was to be no reduction in service quality. Mechanical and electrical maintenance had already been partly outsourced, and they decided to just outsource the rest of that. But with civil maintenance, they had useful engagement with the in-house providers already, and they decided to work with the Australian Services Union in order to transform that in-house. They negotiated an MOU with management, negotiated an MOU with the union, and this is extracting from it. The parties recognise that to compete, Sydney Water needs a highly motivated workforce enabled by systematic trust and fairness. And then they sort of had a series of sort of underlying principles. They wanted a world-class enterprise with the customer at its heart. A high-performance culture where excellence and hard work were fairly rewarded. World-class services that keep down costs for the community. They wanted to build and retain a highly skilled workforce. So there was something in this for both sides. There was an acceptance that things had to change, but that they wanted to work with their workforce and challenge and assist their workforce to succeed. The results, well, electrical and mechanical, which was outsourced, got further cost reductions of 12% and labour productivity improvements of around 20%. So there were some good results in that. With civil maintenance, which is what the Contestability program is about, they got slightly more than the agreed 18.5% in productivity gains. They achieved slightly better than their target within the 3 years. Service reliability improved, water quality complaints fell, workplace safety significantly improved. So this was a successful outcome. What was going on here? Why? Well, I think that there were a number of things happening that made this possible. Firstly, there was external challenge. IPART is a semi-independent. It's a government agency, but it occupies, it functions at arm's length, and it's got a very high reputation. It's a bipartisan instrument, and its results, while governments may not always accept them, its results are highly respected. Its work is highly respected. There was high quality benchmarking already. They had the basis on which they'd been benchmarking for some time. This is water services, water maintenance services are something that are readily benchmarkable because organisations in other cities are doing very, very similar things. You can benchmark very readily. And there had been some previous outsourcing of some of the maintenance, so they had that before and after comparison as well. There was credible threat. There had been outsourcing beforehand, so this is something that the agency was quite comfortable in doing. The Premier had made a comment that they were just at the same time beginning to renegotiate their enterprise agreement, and there was sort of a threat of a bit of challenge, and the Premier sort of made some noises about, well, if they're too silly about this, we will outsource it. So that helped. And there were alternative providers. There were other people around who could fairly readily do this. This was not something that was, the domain knowledge was not so unique that it couldn't have been put out. But also there was a very sophisticated engagement between management staff and unions, and there's some good studies on that, about the process that was gone through here in order to put this in a place where this was possible. Now, it was very challenging, and the union and management, when they went out to talk to the workforce had some very difficult conversations. But they worked that through and delivered the results. The other useful precedent that there's currently a right of centre government in New South Wales at the moment. The previous Labor government had, without calling it contestability, had also gone down this path. So this, at this point in time in the late 90s, early 2000s, New South Wales had one contract prison. And this, it's a minimum medium security, and this was, the Auditor General had compared the contract facility with minimum, and that's not entirely a fair comparison, so that the actual number in itself is not quite as significant. What everyone was noticing was the trend. If you look at that, goes over that 6 years from 13.6 to 45.9% differential. That was what was worrying people. The Labor government understandably didn't want to outsource, and they made it clear that they didn't want to do that. They also made it clear that if the union were not prepared to talk to them about a different way of running prisons, particularly around sick leave and overtime, where there was massive rorting, it's always one of those sort of they are sort of some of those indicators of an unhealthy workplace culture, they would outsource. And so they built 3 new prisons under what was called the Way Forward model, where they negotiated an island agreement, a separate industrial agreement from the one that governed the rest of the prisons. And in 2005, the Public Accounts Committee of the Parliament reported, and the red prisons here are the first 2 Way Forward prisons. The black ones are public sector comparators, and you're looking at overtime and sick leave, and as you can see, the order of magnitude shows there was a significant reduction without any reduction in service quality. Indeed, they're very good prisons. So that far, so far so good. And in the Public Accounts Committee, bipartisan committee, said the government should maintain at least one private prison in the state for the purpose of benchmarking, for the purpose of a comparator. Then, and this is a former Labor minister telling me this story, then they changed ministers, and the union believed that the credible threat had gone away, and the original minister came back and he realised that credible threat had gone away. The union no longer believed that government would go to an alternative, and a Labor government outsourced, without an in-house bid, outsourced an existing prison. First time that had been done in Australia. It wasn't without its controversy, as the signs indicate, and that was done, I was told by someone who was in the cabinet room, that was done in order to create a credible threat. We'll come back on this in a presentation in a minute, but the work I've been doing on this in deliberately applying contestability framework in prisons, we've market tested the management of another facility with an in-house bid, and the in-house team won. And so that's the morning. The guy third from the left is the Commissioner of Corrections. It's what he did the day when he went out to speak to staff at the prison to say they were the preferred bidder. The guy fourth from the left with his thumb up in the air is the union official. We've won. And the Commissioner said to me that there was one of the staff spoke to him and said, the monitoring of this has got to be absolutely clean, because the private sector are going to be looking at us and they're going to be expecting this to be rorted. We've got to prove we can do it as well. There's huge pride comes from winning, and winning on your merits. So, we're looking here at benchmark competition, is what you might call it. And I just want to work through the conditions that, fairly quickly, the conditions that enable this, I think, enable this to succeed. So firstly, distinct units or firms. There need to be distinct somethings that are capable of being compared, that are similar enough to be compared to each other. And they, in order for this to work from a management perspective, in my view, that needs to be where authority and accountability meet. It's got to be at that sweet spot. And that will be different in different service areas. Interestingly, New South Wales has a prison system that is not particularly comparable. Queensland, some decades ago, the state to the north, deliberately began to build a new prison so that the units were more alike each other and therefore could be more comparable. Now, no two things are ever alike, and it is in the nature of to take the prison example, they're going to be doing, and hospitals are the same, schools are the same, they're going to be doing slightly different things.
But I think what you're saying about data and benchmarking and how it drives or enables that contestability is really interesting. And obviously over the last sort of 5-10 years in the UK, we've had a lot of a drive for transparency, and there's lots of data out there now from universities, and probably a good example of this. And such like, have you seen this effect improve as a result, as a consequence of that kind of drive for transparency? Because I guess there's sort of direct benchmarking, particularly in universities.
So I think you're a decade and a half further ahead on some of that. I mean, while I think the league tables generation of transparency was clumsy, and we've got to be very careful with those, because what gets measured gets done, and the media can latch on to certain things and start altering behaviours in very unfair ways. But yes, I mean, look, the data, there's some very interesting studies out of the US looking at, well, from here on both hospitals and education, and from the US in water looking at quality not price, that shows that where you have smaller units that are geographically near each other, and therefore I think more comparable, and maybe the possibility of people moving more readily between them, then the publishing of the mere publication of benchmark data will drive quality improvement. And that's an argument against economies of scale. If you lump it and things are too large, too far apart and too different, then those effects appear not to work. So there's some, I mean, if you're interested in references, I'm happy to provide them. So there's some very interesting work showing that, but I do think, and we'll come onto this more when we get into the prison case study, and I take you through what I've been right in the middle of, and I use it just as a case study. I do think that there is a lot of thought that has to go into the way in which you take this data and you translate it into effects and responses. And that process of engagement with management, staff and unions is, in my view, an important element of that just simply throwing the data out there and publishing it and expecting people to respond, in my view, in the public sector is not sufficient. I think you need to be facilitating transformation and helping people work out how to respond to what they've been given. But yeah, really important question. You need a clear specification of results, a time frame for delivery and realistic budgets. You need to make it clear what it is success looks like, and that needs to be stable, and we'll come back on that as well. I'll touch on it again when we come back to prisons, but one of the key resources we give to the management of frontline public services is time, and anything worthwhile can't be changed in a year. You need to give people time, a period of time and some space. And I understand all the difficulties about doing that in a political environment. One of our responsibilities, I think, as commissioners and as public servants, civil servants, is to create space for the frontline, for those who manage frontline services, to get on and do stuff. And there are skills and arts associated with creating time and space for people to get on and do stuff. And you need realistic budgets. This can't be done, and those who were here last week, I apologise for covering some of the same ground. This can't be done if you give people 26 outcomes and you give them budget for 6. They can't be held accountable in those circumstances. Or if you keep changing the outcomes. Or if you give them conflicting outcomes so that they can't achieve both at the same time. Nobody can be held accountable in those circumstances, and this doesn't work. One of the intriguing insights that I found when we started to do the prisons work is that the managers are not actually managers, they are supervisors. And that is not to criticise them, that's not their fault. They were just prison officers who got promoted to supervisors, and one day they found themselves as the governor of the prison without having ever been trained to be a manager. And when I mentioned this, I ran into the head of one of the consulting firms down the street in Sydney, and I mentioned it to him, and he said, we've just finished a program for State Rail down at that level, and his comment was this. He said, there are no training programs for the factory managers of government. And I find that, and there aren't in New Zealand, there's not in Canada, and to my knowledge there's not here. We do not train people to properly manage in the way that a firm is managed in the private sector. We might give them leadership courses, that's a different thing altogether. But how to frame a budget in the way that the manager of a SME frames a budget, risk management, people management, managing and getting the best out of people. We don't actually, now there's bits and pieces, but not systematic programs. This involves a devolution of control, and it is about matching authority and accountability. You can't hold people accountable for things they don't have authority over. And so when I originally presented on this contestability framework to the prison governors and their senior managers in New South Wales, 2 of them grabbed me as I left and said, don't let them turn this into another bullshit exercise, mate, where they try to hold us accountable for things they won't give us authority for. It's fundamental that we find, and there's a lot of challenges and issues associated with it, we've got to match authority and accountability.
Can I ask, is that a cultural thing? Getting rid of reading countries, why those acts management? Is it done better elsewhere?
Well, it tends to be done better in the private sector, partly because things break and customers walk away and companies go broke more quick, much more rapidly. Not to say that they always get it right. Look, some of this is about an important part of this, I think, is my point about firms. There is a level at which authority and accountability come together, or there are probably several levels, but there are key levels at which they come together. And that's the primary unit, and we need to acknowledge that's the primary unit, and we need to focus on giving authority to and creating an organisational structure that empowers that unit, which can actually be accountable for the delivery of a set of functions. So that some of it is about architecture and design and redesign. But yes, I mean there are cultural dimensions to this. Look, there's a lot of talk in the public sector about economies of scale. I've only ever once in my rather long career with the public sector had somebody produce a graph, and when I in one of the commissioning exercises I've done, said to some people who are running economies of scale with me, could I see the graph? And because until I see a graph that does that, because at some point diseconomies of scale kick in. And if you don't know where it is, then we're talking ideology, we're not talking economics. And so there's a lot of very loose talk about scale and so on within the public sector, and this, I think, is the sort of countervailing set of arguments to that. What's the unit, what's the level at which we can get this, you know, most right? Sorry, you were going to...
I was just thinking that I was really reflecting on what we're often trying to achieve is across a system and across organisational boundaries, and so this issue of not having the authority and therefore accountability and that's perhaps the drive then to do something is what the sort of the root cause of those issues across the system and getting health authorities to work together, etc. And often when we see good case studies where someone has achieved that, it's because of a personal commitment and beyond. So they've kind of almost part the authority idea and said we're going to work with this partner because we believe in what they're trying to achieve and the authority they have. So it's really interesting in the context.
That's right. So I think there's a couple of things. One is there's a joined up commissioning, joined up delivery dichotomy here that I think the commissioning framework helps us to unpack and work through. There's also the difference between collaboration between two organisations where you've got the authority accountability juncture right, then you can begin to have people collaborating. Now that's a different set of challenges, but to blur it all and begin to weaken this, I think, is fatal. I think begins to cause sort of rather fundamental sort of structural flaws in the system, and it isn't a good foundation on which to build joining up or collaboration.
I think that might be partly happening because in some cases there isn't enough political authority to have legislation to make new organisations, so there's a non-legislative solution, which means that literally the authority isn't at the level that you actually are trying to create, and so you are basically expecting people to operate in a without that conjunction of accountability and authority. It probably takes a very charismatic leader or some people that happen to, on a personal basis. It's going to be very individual whether it works in the long term.
Yeah, and in Australia we have the problem of a federation where you've got two. I mean, the thing about a federation is that it is two different levels of government, and they're both sovereign in their own space with some overlap. And you can wind up with, particularly say the health and social care system, you can wind up with things being split right down the middle. I mean, you've got a bit of that here, but I mean, in the Australian system, it is a constitutional divide, not just an administrative one, and so you can wind up with these additional complexities. And so you've not got authority and accountability coming together, and we've had some very innovative design go on in trying to set up institutions that overcome that. So not always successful because a lot of it does depend on bright and comfortable people. You need a quasi-contractual arrangement between commissioners and frontline managers. What do I mean by that? One of the things that I think that where the private sector and the not-for-profit sector have an advantage over the public sector is that they can say, that's a pile of nonsense, I won't sign up to that. Now, they haven't been doing that often enough, I would hasten to add, in recent years. But they can walk away. The public sector very rarely get permission to speak up and to say, excuse me, but you're about to give me 26 outcomes and you've given me budget for 6. I can't do what you say and you can't hold me accountable for what you say. And that conversation back and forwards, now it obviously has got to be framed, it can't go on forever, and the public sector ultimately can't walk away, although a management team could. A manager could say, I won't, that is undoable, it's going to end up in disaster and I will go and do something else, thank you. But framing this so there is the permission for a conversation about results and resources is quite crucial. and that's part of this point about what you do with the data. Setting up a space where there is permission for a conversation and the capabilities and tools for a mature conversation is important. And when we're talking about public delivery, a quasi-contractual relationship between the frontline firms and the support services that will come from elsewhere in government. One of the interesting level playing field problems we encountered when we did this in-house bid in prisons, which I'll come back to in New South Wales, is that the in-house team said you realise that the private sector, if they want corporate support, IT support, maintenance, legal services, they will either have that in-house or they will buy it from providers who will be accountable to them under a contract. We're forced to go back elsewhere in government for these services, and they will just deliver at whatever quality and time suits them. We're at a competitive disadvantage. That is an extraordinarily important insight. And working with, and it's important to find ways to create something that works like a contract, where in this case an in-house team had competed and won against the private sector. If they're going to succeed, they have got to have the capacity to hold the in-government support services that they get to account so that they are able to do a great job.
Gary, apologies for the lateness. Hello everyone, thanks for coming. I think I am violently agreeing with your point. And I take your point to be the need for a negotiated, on both sides and pushback agreement about what will be delivered given the context that will be provided. Is that probably fair?
Yep.
And I completely I'm having a problem with the word contracts because there's so much bad contracting and the purchase of split was done so badly, and it feels as though talking about contracting leads us into worse than good senior management team employee relations or agreement. Do you see what I mean?
So can I suggest to you that is specific to this country at this moment in time. The fact is contracts have been around for an awful long time. They're used in the private sector everywhere. You all have employment contracts. They're just a particular kind of contract. Right? Contracts are universal. So they're just a tool. It's what kind of contract we use. Look, I mean, if you've got into a place in this country where it's not possible to separate out the talk of a knife from the purposes for which we use a knife, then that's really unfortunate. I mean, this is just a knife, and we need to think. We need to think about and understand what the knife's doing, what the contract's doing. And in this case, government can't contract with itself, so they aren't contracts. But there are important lessons we can learn from contracts in the public and private sectors when they're done well, that the traditional handoff, either in command and control to something that we think in the public sector as policymakers we control, or through grants, that traditional relationship is rubbish and needs to be rethought. And contestability, I am submitting, can't work if you don't have some relationship like that where there is a permission to speak back.
Thank you. That's very, very, and you're again, wholeheartedly agree. But perhaps I can just ask you to comment. Ultimately, most of what we're talking about here is interpersonal relationships, and so people also get stuck into the fixed nature of the contract versus the negotiated nature of an agreement, of a relationship. Is that?
Well, those are one of the variables we're dealing with when we look at different kinds of contracts, is how fixed do we want it to be. So one of the things about an employment contract, the workaround in employment law, is that there is what is called the psychological contract. There's what our actual contract of employment says, and there's the way in which we both understand, in fact, our contract works. Right? That's just one of those facts. because written pieces of paper can't do all the work. PFI contracts wound up being a highly fixed, long-term form of contracting, a highly specified and long-term for particular reasons associated with sourcing funding. But in between you have this wide variety. So that question of how much fluidity and informality can we permit here, or should we build in here, is fundamental to what we're doing with this. Down one end we're dealing with things that will have a formal element, but then the informal element will work a great deal, and there'll be a lot of command and control. The nature of the contract is you've just hired a body, and essentially the boss, within limits, the boss can tell you what you do. Whereas down the other end it's quite fixed. So and there's just this vast continuum in between. So we're dealing with, the benefit of the contract methodology is that it forces you to think through certain things that a mere human relationships dimension won't pick up. And I am making that point quite clearly. You do have to have effective design and management of the total delivery system. Most of these things are working within a bigger system, and that has to be done well too. But that's not what I'm talking about just at the moment. You need performance criteria linked to outcome, monitored and reported over time. There's a whole science associated with that. We don't pay anywhere near enough attention to it, and we haven't sweated it anywhere near enough or captured the learnings. You need appropriate and timely financial information. Again, one of the interesting things we're finding in the prisons work as we set up a quasi-contract, an agreement with a public team to deliver, to manage this prison, is that the system isn't really geared to give them the kind of financial information they need in the time frame that they need it in order to manage a business in the way that, say, my brother who manages my late father's business would have and would have to have in order to be able to do his job and know whether they're going to be delivering, and capable to, whether they've got the cash to be able to buy additional supplies, whether working capital's too large. All of that sort of information that is necessary for the running of an SME, typically that is not available to the managers of the firms of government. We don't make the data available in that way, in that same way. Consequences that are proportionate and can be anticipated from the outset. I will come back and you'll see me several times in this, and we'll have a brief session later on in the morning about it. One of the things that struck me as we began to go through this process was the realisation that we talk a lot about accountability in the public sector, but we don't talk about consequences. Of what use, now there are consequences, and we'll talk about that, but they're not fair or proportionate, and they're not connected to the things that we said at the beginning mattered. And as a result, they're not working as a management tool. And accountability isn't working as a management tool. If you want accountability to work as a management tool, then you have to have associated consequences. And I need to be able to know what those consequences will be, what it is will happen, for good or bad to me, for my performance 5 years out in the future. And that needs to be stable. Otherwise it's just simply chopping people's heads off. It's not feeling good about the fact that we've proved to the newspapers and the television how virtuous we are. It isn't actually a tool that's driving fundamental behaviour, behavioural patterns and changes. We'll come back on that. You need escalating interventions and a diverse range of intervention tools. The point of the exercise is to help people succeed, to make it possible for people to succeed. The point of the exercise isn't to fail people, but there has to be, at the end of the day, a realisation that there will be a consequence, and I need to be able to predict pretty much what that's going to be. And obviously, if there's an integrity breach, if I misbehave from the perspective of integrity, then I'm going to go. I mean, that just stands apart from all of this. But in terms of the things that I have been tasked to deliver, I need to know in advance what's going to be required of me. And I need to know there will be consequences. Otherwise, it's just sort of one of those brute facts. Got to happen. And you need people other than me. This is a football manager who's turning up at a press conference as he's been
very contestable, aren't they?
given the heave-ho. If I don't believe there's someone other than me, this is fundamental to contestability. If I don't believe there's someone other than me who can do this job, then I really can't be put to the challenge. I'm just going to keep doing things the way I've done them. A 28% increase in the pay of train drivers. I have no idea how much they're paid, but when you see that kind of an increase, that is a non-contestable system. Right? That's just, you look at that and you go, there's a non-contestable system, because they pushed at management, and management didn't go through the unpleasantness that management are paid to go through, because management know they can just pass it on. That's a monopoly. It's a franchise, but it's a term monopoly. That's just the way it is. Now, just quickly on contracts, for those of you that have to deal with contracts, contestability applies to contracting as well. This is about a number of things. Contract size and duration. A contract should be no bigger or longer than it needs to be. So if you have a 30-year contract for something that doesn't need to be 30 years, you have reduced the amount of contestability. If you contract on a larger scale than you need to, you have problems of physical and human asset specificity. A guy got a Nobel Prize in economics for this. If you hand over a physical asset that is unique and you privatise that and they wind up owning it, you're not going to be able to have another competition because they own the key physical asset. Likewise, you can do that with human beings. You could hand over to a contractor people who are unique, who have the special skills necessary to deliver that can't readily be replaced. So you wind up with a high barrier of entry. And market conditions. I'll just quickly touch on some of that. Just some quick examples. The state of Victoria has outsourced 40% of the state's prisoners are delivered by private providers, the largest anywhere in the world. They have 25-year operating contracts when they don't need to. They've done PFI. You can do the PFI for the ownership of the building. You don't need to have a 25-year operating contract. So lots of outsourcing. They've just done it under a model that's not particularly contestable. Road management. This is an interesting one. In New South Wales, the government decided to contract out not just maintenance but sort of the operation of the road. So management of the roads during periods of stress, the maintenance, the sort of people who come in and out and shut roads and do all of that stuff, event management and so on. Borrowed from here, as you can see, two British companies have come in to that market and formed joint ventures with the two large Australian road construction companies. This was done for political reasons. They didn't realise they were doing it, but they wound up with the right outcome. They said you're not allowed to take over, these big consortia were not allowed to take over their supply chain. They were not allowed to start acquiring the SMEs who actually do the work. As I said, that was done for political reasons. It's a good economic outcome because you get to the end of 7 or 10 years, it's a 7+3, and you want to have another competition. If they've taken over the supply chain, you can't have another competition. Whereas if what it is a layer of management, that is much more contestable. I mean, obviously there's still some domain knowledge, but that's more contestable than if they own the entire supply chain. Yes?
Nice example is library books. The stock always stays owned by the council for obvious reasons, but
Buses. We have this often in Australia where the government has a monopoly over the inner part, but the outer part, which grew later, were franchises that grew over time and became fixed. Now they've just been cracked open. You get the problem. This is a problem in London because the TfL for years has tried to get new entrants into the London market, but the depots are owned by the providers. And the new entrants have said, there's nowhere else to put a depot. We can't possibly enter this market. Government should own the depots, or it should have a legal mechanism for transitioning the depots. It's got locked in. The other thing that's interesting is that when I was in government, 25 years ago, they had 1 year contracts. And as I said to them, a 1 year contract is just a perpetual license. That's meaningless. You've basically given these people a perpetual franchise. And they had invested on that basis. And so it took decades to get out of this mess that had been created by a system that wasn't thought about at all. It just grew up.
I think there's even a bigger problem. I mean, I completely agree with you about the thing you want to avoid is a monopoly. And possibly a private sector monopoly is slightly worse than the public sector.
Oh, it's usually much worse than a public one.
You're better off with the public sector monopoly, but could there be a bigger problem around procurement law? That, I think it's the case that because of the sort of requirements for sort of financial, for qualifying to bid, you've kind of got a sort of small number of big firms that bid for all the big contracts.
So not necessarily a problem. Remember, this is contestability, so we don't need large numbers. So if we get the setting right, so if you just go back to that previous example, if what you do is you set up the system so that they are performing the function that you need large to perform, but you don't permit you don't permit them to step in and take over the bits that they don't need to, then effectively you might have them, for example, as an integrator managing your supply chain for you. So there may be functions that PFI, there's no fundamental reason why. PFI is actually, Australia did this, we really began PFI before the UK did. It's generally worked pretty well for us. It's not been, the thing was done here for the wrong reasons, and it led to some perverse behaviours. We by and large avoided those bad incentives. But you might want a 30-year contract for the finance and owning of the facility. And the maintenance. You don't need to have usually a 30-year contract for the operation of that. So you can break those, and you could have an initial 10 perhaps, and then have a recompete or whatever. It's not. You don't have to. The bits that need to be done by big and hairy don't always have to be connected to. But sometimes, if we're talking about franchising a rail system or a nuclear power station, we may be, in fact, it's just big and hairy. That's just what it is, and you've got to live with that. And by and large, government won't want to develop those capabilities in house. So there are defence, large parts of the defence system. The people who provide them have just got to be big. And there won't be a lot of them. So that's the reality of that, and you've got to live with it. So this is about design and about thinking in advance, what are the features here that about this particular service and about this particular market, and how do I make sure I have contestability within that context.
I think it's worth adding though, with assets and with unique people, you can have a sort of lease and return. So I don't know if the people here from MOD, but as I understand it, specific things like nuclear engineering, there's negotiations with industry about, do you expect the MOD people to send them away into industry, but you can have a contract whereby if they're bidding, they have to give them back at the end of the contract.
Yep. There's a whole variety of those tools you can use. This is sort of one of those, again, this is an asset specificity example. In 2000, the government sold its hospital linen facility to Spotless with a 10-year contract. They broke the market up into 3 regions, and the contracts went in several different places. In 2010, within a year, all 3 contracts had come back to Spotless because Spotless owned the key facility in that particular city. Right? They just simply couldn't make it contestable. It was too late. They had given away the core asset. This is an interesting one, and it shows you why you need to understand your market sometimes to do this. So public pathology, the question of, can you contract that? Well, we have this, and the public sector accounts for 40% of all tests. Australia has a very vigorous private sector pathology market, really world's best practice. I mean, they just do a brilliant job at the sort of GP level. But our hospitals are overwhelmingly public, certainly the big ones are, and the public sector accounts for 40% of all tests. The private sector, in several of the eastern states, the 3 large providers account for 70% of all tests. So really it's 2 who dominate the market, and the competition regulator has said these companies are not to do any more acquisitions. There is already too much market concentration for the private, the GP pathology tests. Now, 2 largest providers. Now we want to, if we were to go down the path, as some governments were considering, of outsourcing the public sector pathology, there's a whole lot of different models you could use, but you need to be aware of the fact that there's a duopoly. And you could, if you outsourced it or sold it, you could just wind up committing yourself to a market that was already at a state where, and you're putting 40%, you're sort of, it's almost doubling it. You could be skewing the market in a horrific way, and you, the government, have a responsibility not only to the existing market not to mess it up any further, but to put yourself in a position where you're handing it over to a quasi-monopoly. So in some cases, what you're doing here, you need to understand the context that you're going into. Quickly, benefits. You can plan and manage service delivery systems while drawing on the benefits of potential competition. You can actually keep these things in-house while getting benefit. Better service continuity. Outsourcing's got a lot of discontinuity with it. One of the benefits of a contestable framework where you're challenging your in-house provider is that you keep the benefits of continuity whilst maintaining challenge. You honour public sector delivery, which matters to me. It recognises the importance of the employment relationship, and that's important for left of centre governments. The employment relationship is hugely important. And while we need to challenge, it's utterly, and if you get a Labor government come in here, their initial view is going to be let's pull back on all this challenge stuff and let's embrace and be all good mates. And about, I don't know, we'll see how quick it takes. But within some period of time, they're going to realise that you can't do that. At some point, management have got to be management and make some tough decisions, and they've got to have a robust conversation with their workers and their representatives. I remember Jack Dromey years ago saying to me, he said, we need all this sort of elected representatives on boards. He says, we don't want that. He said, you need 2 strong parties who can challenge each other and then work together. They've got separate jobs to do. They've got to have robust conversations and debates, and having had that conversation, you then get on and do it. There are the challenges of it. It can be confused with outsourcing. I'm doing all that I can to clarify that within an Australian context. You do have sometimes difficulty creating consequences, although we'll come back on that and some of the things we're doing. You've still got this challenge of how you prioritise outcomes. You've got to ensure proportionate interventions, and that can be difficult in a political environment. I get that. I still think that there's clever things that good civil servants and public servants can do in order to frame that and make it more possible. There is this problem of how to honour excellence. It's much easier to punish people who fall short of best behaviour, and we all do. In the real world, none of us ever performs perfectly. So there is this really interesting challenge of how do we honour excellence and not just discipline people who fall short. It does require new capabilities, and it does require you to challenge the workforce to reform. Comments, questions? Benjamin. Sorry, yeah.
Come back to this thing. I'm just thinking about the earlier thing about accountability within broader systems, because I get the argument. I get how you can have a contestable scenario for a thing like a prison or a hospital or a school and facility of some description, as long as that facility is considered in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, those facilities don't exist in isolation. A prison can be the best prison in the world. If it hasn't got effective aftercare services for prisoners, its impact is diminished. Pet hospital, same kind of thing. So, and influencing those kind of system issues are very difficult and are not necessarily measurable in an obvious kind of way. And I don't think contestable in the same kind of way you're describing.
Mm-hmm.
And everything exists in a system, and most of the kind of public sector challenges we have are about systems. Different with lots of moving parts in them.
Yep.
How to get them to work better. So, could you say something maybe about contestability in that context? Contestability in a kind of more complex system?
No, because at the end of the day, systems are systems of parts, and this is about the parts. The huge insight I have on leaving government, which this has informed this, is that there are certain natural units within government, natural firms, I would now comfortably call them. And that's just it. I mean, a prison's a prison. We put a big wall around it in order to stop people wandering in and out. Now, it is connected to a whole lot of other things elsewhere, but somewhere in the system you have got to bring accountability and authority together. Otherwise, you don't have management. And you can't certainly hold anyone accountable for anything. So the answer is, get the systems point, and we'll talk a little bit more about a certain aspects of a systems approach this afternoon when we talk about markets or systems, because a lot of the things we call markets are contestable systems in the public sector. But they are systems of parts, and we do need a theory of the parts as well as a theory of the system. So this is about giving much clearer responsibilities to the people who run the important parts, where the authority and accountability come together. Can I say, I'm working on this in a very applied way in the prison space, and we'll come on to that after some morning tea. And in practice, certainly within the prison system, you can make sense of those two different conversations together. It's not a huge challenge. I think health and social care is much more problematic because they are quite fragmented, and to this date we haven't settled on a model for the system that would enable us to think about how to get the parts to interrelate, which is the reason why 30 years on, that question of joined up commissioning in health and social care. I mean, commissioning in a lot of ways begins in this country with that question of joining up health and social care so that they make sense to the people who've got to go through the system. It's really complex, and so I think that that question of the relationship between the system and the parts is much more problematic there than, say, in corrections. Corrections is a much tighter system, and you can achieve that balance, I think, more readily. But the parts are there, and we do need a theory of the parts and the relationship to the parts, as well as a theory about the system. You've got to have both.
I've got a bit of a problem with the parts theory, because it strikes me that through my career, what often happens is that you get sort of periodic changes in the structure and the division into parts. Because often one division will be good for one thing and another division will be good for another. So, for example, in schools, having smaller autonomous units is very good from the point of view of education and achievement, but it's not the right way to run the school estate. So, you will flip then from smaller units to bigger units.
Well, or you come up with a model that bundles the packages in a different way, so that you separate the teaching from So you can get the joining up through a whole variety of different tools. But at the end, schooling is a good example. A school is a school is a school. I've interviewed principals who were principals of 2 schools, but it wasn't one Flurgle that he was running. He was running 2 schools. A school is a school. It works. Now there are things within it. There are classrooms, which are another really, really important unit, and we get that in hospitals as well. But this is about tight and loose coupling. Schools are tightly coupled as a school. A prison is tightly coupled as a prison. Now they've got a lot of other really important connections, and when it comes to reducing reoffending in prisons, we need to spend a lot more time thinking about the connections out to the community. When it comes to hospitals, there's got to be a much more sophisticated thinking done, and a lot of work's been done about the connections elsewhere. But at the end of the day, a hospital's a factory for making people better or for easing their pain, and it's got to work. And if the system override is so strong that those people can't run a tightly coupled institution, a factory, then they can't do their job. So I think there's no reason why you have to have a bursar at every single school. You can have multiple bursars across, there's one bursar across multiple schools. There's ways that all could be dealt with in order to achieve the economies for the different functions.
So you've got to think about the relationships then, haven't
you do.
The wider system.
Yep. But when I went back to Australia from here, 2011, I didn't want to concentrate on contracting and commissioning. And I started to do work on the management of frontline services, and went out and interviewed a whole lot of the managers of frontline services. Right across the range, the whole suite of public service. You should hear what those people have to say about how mad the current system is, and how much could be possible if their world could be framed in a somewhat different way. Yes.
It's really interesting to hear about contestability sort of being used as a tool for behaviour change, essentially, amongst people working in the public service. Do you see it as is there like an escalation route that you think there's, if the service isn't being run properly, there's sort of one approach you would start with, then it comes up to the point that contestability would be the appropriate response, or do you feel like actually it's something that should be a feature generally?
So we'll come back on this with the outcomes framework, which we'll talk a little bit about before lunch. I think the simple answer is that contestability has got to be there the whole time. I need to know years in advance what's going to happen to me if I don't achieve certain results. Otherwise it's not working as a management tool. But in the stuff we're doing in prisons, the message is quite clear. The early interventions are about helping you to succeed. The initial interventions, if you're not succeeding, will be for us to put in support, to train you, or to provide those additional skills that you need to succeed. So that part of it, if you can't credibly get the message across to your own management and staff, I want you to succeed, then you've failed. But equally, management at least, because at the end of the day it's not staff's fault. I mean, staff need to be challenged, but in a quite different way. Management has got to understand if they can't do it. Now what we've had in one of the prisons in New South Wales, first time in recent memory at least, somebody who was ready to sort of step up to a governor's role has said, excuse me, but can I get a voluntary redundancy because I can't do that job. I can't do the job that is now being asked of that role. And that's a healthy thing. Some people don't want to be managers. I think we ought to find a role for great prison officers, just as we should find a role for great teachers. They shouldn't have to all go up and be managers, because some people are not managers. But somebody who takes that step needs to understand they are going to be a manager. And they should understand what that will mean, and they should be obviously given the skills to get there. So I think contestability has got to be built right through the system, but in those early stages, there needs to be and I'll take you through an outline of what we're doing in the corrections space. Lots of interest from around the place in what we're doing with this, of course, because this is difficult stuff to do and to keep doing, not for reasons that are not hard to understand. So I think it's got to be built in, but the early, just as a private sector firm would do, your early interventions when your people aren't performing is, unless you've somehow discovered you've got it horribly wrong and this person's a hopeless manager, you want to help that person succeed. But they will know that in the private sector, they will know that if they don't get it right, they're for the high jump. And that's, you've got to know that.
See that, is it, I imagine it must be very important that people within that prison, for example, feel like they are going to be fairly assessed against a private sector competitor bid. So
what we've done in the benchmarking, good question, what we've done in the benchmarking we've done, so we're doing several things. Firstly, the performance side, the service side of it is going to be essentially the same, public and private. I mean, the things you would ask of a contract prison are going to be essentially the same as we would ask of a public prison. They'll be a bit different based on functions. So that side of it's essentially the same. The resource benchmarking, benchmarked against other prisons within the New South Wales system, benchmarked with other public prisons within another state, and benchmarked against the private prisons. But all of those you've got to, the thing about benchmarks is that they're always rough. And so you've got to just respect the fact that none of these things are actually alike. And so the contract prisons are different for reasons that are, some of which are fine, you can learn from them, others they're different for reasons that are quite different. The most important benchmarking we've been doing has been against other public prisons, and so you're able to say, well look, those prisons are able to do this without, that are pretty similar to you. Now you've got to be careful with that here, with that again, because if you wind up too tightly comparing things and comparing two things that are not alike, you can cause serious breakages, and that's what happened in the prisons with the benchmarking here in the UK. What we've done, and I'll come back on this with great pride, we're going out and taking the benchmarks out to management and then to staff and unions, and we're discussing it with them, and they're workshopping it and looking at its applicability to them and how, whether it's right or wrong, and how they would respond. That part of that process is just fundamental. There's got to be ownership and understanding of that.
Thanks, Gary. This is really so